we're talking about half square triangles today. And I love half square triangles. They're so versatile. You can make so many different patterns with them. For example, this wall hanging up here is different half square triangles. They're just different sizes. So half square triangle in the center, half square triangle here. This makes a friendship star. And then big half square triangles right there to make another friendship star, a bigger one. And the block that we're making today, I made mine into a pillow. So a lot of different options you can do with half square triangles. A couple other examples. This one, I'm still quilting it, but this is all half square triangles. It's a scrappy design, and just using the values of the fabric kind of created some patterns and design on the quilt. But they're all 4.5 inch square half square triangles. This one, another example, they're all 4.5 inch half square triangles, and they finish up in the quilt with the seam allowance. Once you get the seam allowance, each block, each square is 4 inches. So just a lot of versatility using half square triangles, depending on which fabrics you use and how you lay them out. And what's nice about the pattern that we're working on today is that you can make these half square triangles any size. The whole pattern is made up of 16 half square triangles. So it doesn't matter what size you make them. These are finished, I think, at 3 inch, right? At 3 inch, but if you made them finish at 2.5, you'd have a little bit smaller block. If you made them finish at 4 inches, you'd have a little bit bigger block. And then you can take this design, this block, and you could lay out 3 or 4 different blocks and make a table runner. You could make maybe 35, 42 blocks if you want, all the same, and put them side by side, rows and columns, and make a whole quilt out of it. So a lot of options with this pattern. You could also just put the border on and quilt it on the back and put a binding and make a small wall hanging like this. Makes a nice fall decor. I'm kind of into pillows right now. I love making pillows, and this is just a pillowcase basically that you put over top of a pillow, put on a pillow form, put a pillow inside. So I can change out my pillows for every season. So next, I want to talk about the different ways that you can make half square triangles. And I have a list of 6 different ways that you can make half square triangles. And the tricky part about the different methods is just knowing what size your blocks are going to end up being. So you might need to start with bigger squares to get the right size blocks that you want. So the first one is, and I've done a little bit of the step already, is you take a 5.5 inch square, and and we've got 2. So I've got the darker fabric and the lighter fabric, and we always put right sides together when making blocks. So then I sew all the way around the edge, and then let me tip you down so you can see my mat here. And then what we're going to do is cut corner to corner both ways. Well, I didn't have to separate that, but I normally don't draw a line there, but I drew it for you guys so you could see where I'm going to cut. So just line up the ruler corner to corner. Using this method, you end up with 4 half square triangles. So the advantage to that is that you make 4 at a time. A disadvantage on this is that this edge here, where you're going to sew the blocks together, is cut on the bias, and that can cause some stretching when you're sewing your seams. So if you were going to sew 2 of these together, those seams are stretchy, so your blocks can get distorted. So that's not really my favorite way of doing it, but it is one way. And kind of the disadvantage of that can be that now you have 4 that are exactly the same. And if you only need 2 for your pattern, now you've got 2 extras that you won't use. So that's one of the disadvantages there. But it does go quickly. Another way to do it is to take an 8-inch square. So I've got my light fabric and my dark fabric, and draw a line corner to corner both ways. So now can you see I've got 4 triangles. I'll end up with 4 triangles, or 4 half square triangles. Now in this one, I marked the lines, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch on both sides of that line. So I'm going to sew this one up real quick. And what's nice about this is that you don't have to be super accurate on your seam allowance. You just want to be pretty close. Because after we get these cut, we're going to trim them up. Okay, so I got down that end. I'm going to flip around and I'm not going to break the thread or anything, and just go down the other side. Let's see if I can get the lighting. The only problem with my machine is that the light is so bright, I don't know if you guys can see it, see my sewing. Okay, and now I'm gonna come down. Oh, that's probably not helping any. Maybe that one's too bright. There we go. Now I'm going to sew on both sides of the other X. Just lift your presser foot and flip it around. Okay, so I've got some dark gray thread in there, hopefully, so you can see where I've stitched. So now I'm going to cut on the blue lines, the marked lines, and I'll end up with 4 half square triangles. And my ruler's not quite big enough, but this will work. oops. Yeah, no, that's right. So I cut those apart, and then I don't have a big ruler, but then you also cut horizontal and diagonally on all the pieces. So you end up with 8 triangles using this method. And my ruler's almost long enough. So you're cutting an X and you're cutting a plus sign, basically. That's what it looks like. So I want to make sure I've got my lines straight. There we go. All right, so we open it up and we have our half square triangle. So we end up with 8 using this method. And again, this is pretty quick when you need to make a lot of half square triangles that are all the same. But if you don't want that many that are all the same, that's the disadvantage. But there, that took me, you know, what, a couple minutes to make 8 half square triangles. We still have to trim them up, and I'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. Let's see. Okay, so that was the 8-inch square. And then similar to that, I'm not going to do this one because it's basically the same method that I just did. But Moda company has created these cake mix recipes. And basically what it is, it's a paper template that you use with 10-inch squares. So you can buy pre-cuts in a stack that are 10-inch squares, and they call them a layer cake. So you put your 2 10-inch squares together, right sides together. Oop, I think I've got mine flipped. There we go. You do right sides together, and then your paper goes on top. And then you can put a couple pins in it. But then it's basically doing the same thing we did with the 8-inch square, just this is bigger. And they have it marked where you start, and they have you just go in this direction like this. So you're doing each little leg separately. So you're just sewing once around. You don't have to flip it like I was doing. But it's basically the same method, just these papers make it real easy because you have a sew line, and if you stay on that sewing line, you'll have accurate squares. And then once you have all the pieces sewn, and you sew right through the paper, you just leave this on, put it in your machine, sew right through the paper. So you probably want to use a little bit of a lower, shorter stitch length so that you can tear the papers off. So once you have everything sewn, then same thing, you cut it horizontal and vertical, and then diagonally both ways, and you end up with 8 pieces. But what's nice about this one is there's also a trim line. So you trim off the very edge. You can see here, there's a cut line along the very edge. So I usually trim that first. So I would take my ruler and trim on that cut line right there on each side. And this is the method that I used for this Chevron quilt. And I had a stack of 10-inch squares, and then I cut. So the 10-inch squares were for the print, and then I cut 10-inch squares of the white background. You can also buy a package of 10-inch squares in solid colors too. But I had white, so I just cut squares and layered a print with a white fabric and did my cutouts, my sewing and my cutouts using these paper templates. That's why I only have one left. And there's a lot of
Lucy,
different,
where do you get those? Where can you get those?
a lot of the quilt shops will carry them. I know I live north of, well, I'm right in Spring Branch, Bulverde, off of 46. So I usually go up to the Blanco quilt shop. It's called Uptown Blanco Textile Studio, and I know they carry these. I ordered mine through Missouri Star Quilt Company. I just ordered them online. But most of the quilt shops will carry them, and there's a whole slew of different patterns you can make. I haven't used this one. This is number 6, and it has a variety. It has some rectangles and some triangles in it. So each 10-inch square you get 2, 4, 6, 8 small half square triangles and 4, looks like 8 squares, but they're two-tone squares. So like if you're making a churn dash, it would give you probably 2 blocks. You'd have the 4 corners are half square triangles and your 4 sides, and then you just need to add a center piece, which is this piece right here. So you cut this out. You don't have to sew anything on that, but it's nice because they give you the sew lines, and then you just cut everything and then piece your block together.
Thank you.
Sure. But there's a whole bunch of different recipes. This one for the half square triangles is recipe number 4. Okay, so we don't need this anymore. Another method is to take 2.5-inch strips, and I just have a little short piece here. It's probably about 17 inches long. And so again, right sides together, and then on this you sew down both sides, both edges, both cut edges, and then you take you need a kind of a special ruler, and so I have this triangle ruler here, and so what I did is I just put it on here, and I know so depending on the width of your strips, you're going to get different size half square triangles. So with a 2.5-inch strip, you'll get 3.5-inch triangles. So with this trimmer that I have, there is a 3.5-inch guideline, and I just put that right on my seam, right on my sew line. And then you trim along the ruler. And what this does is you don't need this little very tip because of your seam allowances. You don't need that. You kind of save a little bit of fabric doing it this way. So this is a pretty efficient way to do it too. And then because you've sewn on the top there, you just have to, there's a few stitches there. Sometimes they'll pop out, or you might just have to take a seam ripper and remove those stitches, and there's your half square triangle. And for these, you don't have to trim them. That's the beauty of using the strips, is that when you cut using that trimmer, and there's different rulers too, different triangle trimmer rulers. I have to cut off my dog ears, these little corners here, we call those dog ears. I have to trim that off. But once I do that, you can see my block is exactly 3.5 inches. So I don't have to trim up or square up. And because your seam allowance is going to, you know, cover up, that's kind of like the dog ear, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so that's one way. And then, so what's nice about this is you can get quite a few from a strip. So for this particular, it's about 17 inches long. I have 2, 3, 4, I've got 5. I'm able to get 5 half square triangles out of it. Now, another way to do it, which is kind of nice if you're working with smaller triangles, and that's to use this, they're called triangle papers on a roll. So you have a roll of, it's kind of like the cake mix recipes, but this is on a roll of paper. So you would just roll out what you need. And so if I want to start at the edge here so I get a full one. And then you could cut, I'll cut right about here. So just like the cake mix, you would then pin this, or you could use these. I like using these Wonder clips. You can clip the paper to your fabric. And then you just do your zigzag sewing. So you'd sew on the top part and then you'd sew on the bottom part. So the dotted line is the sew part, and then the solid line is the trim part. But with this particular paper, you are trimming along this solid line on both sides. So you do lose a lot of fabric. But this paper makes 1 inch finished half square triangles. But it's nice to have the paper because it's more accurate than just sewing tiny pieces on your machine. So for example, let me find one. Well, this is even bigger. Got some small ones here. Hold on. So this is how small. I think this one is. No, this is 2.5. So even smaller, you know, 1.5, finishing at 1 inch. That's really tiny once you put it into a quilt. When you get that small, it's hard to true up little pieces. You know, it's harder to iron, to true them up, to trim them. So using this method when you need small pieces is really great because you have the exact sew line, you have the exact cut line, and then once you cut it all apart, you're done, and you just have to press them open. And so it's really easy to get accurate pieces that way, especially when you're doing smaller blocks. But this is a real quick, this one where you use the sew down both sides. That's another nice way, because you can do smaller strips, you know, just 17 inches and maybe get 4 or 5 the same. So that's another way. So the method that we're going to use today is making 2 at a time. And I had my pieces cut out for the block today. And I'll just take, so this is my A fabric and one of my B fabrics. And so I picked the lighter one and draw a line, just one line corner to corner. And this method will make 2 half square triangles. There, so I drew my line, and I'm going to sew on either side of that line. So put your fabrics right sides together, and then sew on either side. Okay, and then you cut diagonally in between those 2 lines where you drew the pencil line. And we end up with 2 half square triangles. And what's nice about this is that the bias is now in this seam. And so when we sew our blocks together, we're sewing on the straight grain, and it doesn't have that much stretch to it. So I prefer this method, and that way you have 2 that are the same. You can use smaller scraps. You don't have to have, big 10-inch squares or big 8-inch squares. You can use smaller pieces, and if you only need 2 for your pattern, you have them done, or you might just need 4. So, 2 squares, and you have your 4 half square triangles. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is trimming. We call them trimming or chewing up or squaring up. Usually it's referred to as trimming your half square triangles. So for our particular pattern, we need 3.5-inch squares. So what I want to do first is I'm going to show a couple different methods. So I'm going to press this one open. And then a couple different ways. Let's see if my rotating mat will work. Is to put your square down and then just use any ruler that has a 45-degree angle on it. And what you do is you line up the 45-degree angle on your seam, and then you're going to look at your 3.5-inch. You're going to look at 3.5-inch markers and make sure that you have enough fabric to trim all the way around. And so you trim 2 sides. This one's so tiny, it's hard to turn. Turn it all the way around. And I'm going to take this particular ruler, I can just slide it down. I want to get rid of those little trimmings so I can see my edges. And those cut edges now will go right on my 3.5-inch mark along here and here. And again, I still have the 45-degree line coming down here, so I can match that up too. What you really want to focus on is where does that seam come into your point? You want that seam to intersect your point. If it doesn't, then you're going to lose some of your points when you sew it into a block. So see how my seam goes right into it divides that point right in half. Okay. So that's one way, just any, any small ruler that has a 45-degree angle. If I'm making bigger blocks, sometimes I'll use this ruler, and it has the 45-degree. It also has some marks in here that are a little bit bolder. So for 3.5, let me press one of these open. So for the 3.5-inch mark, it's a bold, solid line that I can really see exactly where it's going to fall on my fabric. So I line up my 45-degree on the seam line, trim those two sides, turn the block. And on this particular ruler, I wouldn't slide the ruler. I would keep the ruler in the same position, line up my 45-degree on the seam line, line up my 3.5 on the cut edges. And trim those two sides. So now we have an exact 3.5-inch square block. So that's what we mean by trimming up. Now some patterns, for example, for a 3.5-inch block or square, they'll say to cut 3 7/8 inch squares. And so when you do that, you press it open and you're done. But because you're sewing on the bias and cutting on the bias and pressing it over, a lot of times they get a little bit uneven. So a lot of people in the newer patterns, at least, a lot of patterns will say to use 4-inch squares and then trim it down to 3.5. So a lot of times if I'm reading a pattern or making a pattern for the first time, I'll read through it and see if there's any half square triangles and what do the cutting instructions say. And if the cutting instructions say 3 7/8, I'll change my notes. I'll scratch through it and say, no, cut it 4 inches. So before I cut anything, I read through the pattern to make sure that if there are half square triangles, I'm making them a little bit bigger and trimming them down. Some people will even go a 1/4 inch bigger. So instead of cutting 4-inch squares, they'll go 4 1/4 and then trim it down to 3.5. But I find that the 1/2 inch bigger is a good rule. So if you're going to trim down to 3.5, start with 4-inch blocks. If you're going to trim to 4.5-inch blocks, start with 5-inch squares. Okay, so that's 2 ways of trimming. Let's see. Then there's this other specialty ruler that is called the block lock. BLOC-LOC, no K's. All right, so let me press another one open. And what's nice about this one is there's a little groove down the center here. You can see it's a little bit frosted. And you want to take the edge that goes corner to corner, lay it down on your block so that lip there now nests right up against your seam. So you don't have to sit here and try to figure out, well, where's my 45-degree line and try to get that right on your seam. This one's a lot faster because you just you put your ruler down and you just slide it up against that seam. And so it's locked up against that seam now. Now I can slide it on the diagonal to get my 3.5-inch squared on my fabric, on my block. So again, you just trim two sides. And now this one, you leave the ruler where it is, locked up against that seam, and you just slide it down to the other corner. And then it's usually easier to rotate it. But you're sliding the ruler instead of turning the ruler, because now when I'm doing this side, my seam, because I pressed it to the blue, my bulk seam is on the blue, and I want the ruler to stay locked up against that side of the seam. Does that make sense? But it's just a lot quicker. It's the same as using a regular ruler with a 45-degree angle. It's just the 45-degree. There's a groove there, so you can just kind of nest it up against the bulk of your seam. So there we go. I mean, that's really nice, accurate, squared up. I put it on my mat here. You can see it's really precise. So that's a really nice ruler. It is expensive, but it is a nice ruler. The one that I just got the block lock so I could teach it in this class, because I've been using this one, and it's called the Clearly Perfect Slotted Trimmers. And this one has worked really well for me. And the reason I like this one is that you don't press your block open. You take your block before you press it open, keep it together like that, and you put the ruler down, and there's a 3.5-inch guideline there, and I put it just maybe a thread or two above my stitch line, and then you trim both sides, and there's a little groove here where you can put your cutter in, and that trims off the dog ears. And so you end up, it's all trimmed all the way around. So you don't have to rotate it and trim the other side. Now I press it open. And when you're pressing open half square triangles, you want to be careful not to stretch your fabric. So I usually we called it a finger press, but I'm usually using my fingernail. So fingernail press. Press it down real good. And there you have your finished, or your trimmed block. And it comes out pretty accurate. I think the block lock is probably just a little bit more accurate, but those came out pretty good, pretty close to each other. But the reason I like this trimmer is that you just have to cut those two sides and trim off your dog ears, and you're done. You don't have to rotate. You don't have to cut individually all four sides. Okay, so here's a little example on how versatile these little blocks are. So we've got four blocks now trimmed up. I'm going to make a little pinwheel using these 4 blocks. How cute is that? So you can arrange these almost any way you want. You can do a 4-patch that has them all going this way. You can point your blues to the center, and now you have you'll look like a square in a square. You can put 2 together, and that makes a flying geese. Put these 2 together like this, so you could do a whole row of flying geese like that. Or like I did on my chevron, depending on how you place the blues, you can create a chevron. Just go all the way across your row. All right. Any questions on the different ways to trim and different ways to make half square triangles? All right. So let's get started on our pattern. That. And let me sit down. Now the way I'm, excuse me, the way I'm making my block is similar to how I made my sample that's in the pillow. You could put background. So I call this cream color the background fabric. You could put this background fabric in the center also, and then it would highlight this this orangey part a little more. So like I said, depending on how you place your colors, your blocks can come out all different. But I am using 3 different colors plus the background. So four different sets of squares. So I have, in the pattern, I've identified A, B, C, and D. So D being my background. So today I'm using a gold for A. That's going to be my center. And instead of orange or red, I'm using this brown. It's a pretty print. It has some rusty red and some golden brown. That's going to be my B, which is on the pattern. It's the red orange fabric. And then this is going to be my C fabric. It's a dark green, and that will be instead of the brown on the pattern. And then D is the background. So just another tan cream color to go with the golds and browns. So I have all my squares cut out. And if you printed your pattern, you should have 2 of block A, of square A, 4 of square B, 4 of square C, and 6 of square D. And then in order to pair them up to get the pattern that I'm making, I need to look at which colors do I need to pair together, because in my pattern, I never put an A with a C or A with a D. So I kind of made myself some notes. If you had bought a pattern, it would have this information. It would say, match an A square with a B square and make 4 half square triangles. So that's what I've done here. I did that first one for you earlier. Here's my other half. So I've got 2 finished, and I need to do 1 more. So I'm matching an A with a B, and then we need to draw lines on the back. And you could, I usually do that first. So one of the squares needs a line in order for you to do your seams. So I draw my line, and I'm going to put right sides together, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch on both sides of that line. So I just go down one side and flip it around, go down the other side. And there's my second block. And then you could take scissors and just cut down there if you want, or take a rotary cutter and a ruler, cut your triangles apart. And now I have two more. So I'll have 4 in total to go in the center. So one, here, you can't see. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and this gold, the gold will go towards the center on each one and form that square in the center. So I'm going to set those aside. Now, when I'm making a quilt, or even just one block like this one, I like to chain piece. And what that means is, instead of just doing one square like I just did, I'll do all my squares at one time. So let's see how we have to pair these up. So we did the A-B combination. Next, we need the B and D combination. So we have, oh, you can't see my finger. So we have B and D here. So what that is that's the orange in the background, or in my case, this, I'll just call it brown. So the brown in the background, brown in the background, brown in the background, brown in the background. So I need 4 half square triangles for that, which is 2 squares each. So I'm going to take my two B's, and I'm going to take 2 D's. So you guys might want to take notes on this. So we started with A and B combinations. We did 2 squares each. And then we're doing B and D combinations, 2 squares each. So again, I start with my line. I can't see it on my table. Can't see the edges. And you can use a pencil, you can use a pen. This is going to be hidden in the seam allowance, so it really isn't a big deal. I have these, they're called friction pens, Frixion. And they iron off. And you can also erase them if you get them in the wrong place and you want to remark your spot. This particular one is erasable. So I can come in here with an eraser and, well, oh, no, I guess it means it erases with the iron. It just says erasable. So I would think an eraser, but I think they mean an iron. It's more like disappearing. Hold on, my iron is shut off. Oop. There we go. So if I iron where I drew that line, now it's gone. It disappeared. It erased. So I guess that's what they mean. All right, so let me put that back on. But I only use this for marking stuff that I know is either going to get trimmed off or will be hidden in seam allowances. I don't trust it to totally disappear forever. Okay, so I'm going to put together a background in my B fabric, background in my B fabric. So I'm just going to start lining these up. And then the other And then the last combination are to take the 4 C squares and match them up with the remaining 4 D squares or the background. So again, I'm just going to mark my guideline, and remember we're sewing a 1/4 inch on both sides of this seam. Not this seam, sorry, this pencil line. So we're drawing our guideline, and then that's where we're going to cut them apart at the end. And for making the blocks, we sew a 1/4 inch on each side of that line. There we go. Okay, so I'm gonna set those aside for a second, and I'm going to start with these 2 squares and my matching pair, and I'm just going to run them through the machine on one side. And I usually sew on the left side first, and then when I flip it around, I'm sewing on the left side again. So I run that block through, make sure these are lined up. Run that one through. And now I'm going to start doing these. So I'm going to take a green and place a background on top of it, line them up, and sew down one side. So we're just doing one side for now. Okay, here's our last one. Okay, so there's my chain piecing. My crumbs out of the way. There's my chain piecing. So I'm going to leave them all attached, and I'm just going to flip it around, and I'm going to sew down the other side of every block. Okay, now I can trim my threads. And now I'll just cut these all apart, just to separate them, because we don't need them attached to each other. And what's nice with half square triangles, because you're going to trim the blocks anyway, your seam allowance is not critical. You want to try to have an accurate 1/4 inch seam, but as long as you've sewed a straight line, you'll be fine. So now I'm going to come over to my cutting mat, and I'm just going to cut all of these in half. Finish with that. Oops. Ah, not going through all the layers. Okay. Now I'm going to try to use my bigger, I have a bigger rotating mat. Let's see if that'll work. It works pretty good on my dining room table. Might not have enough room to turn it. Yeah, I don't think that's going to work. Here. Move my machine over a little bit. There we go. That might work. Okay, so the next step is to trim these. So depending on the method that you're going to use, you want to get your ruler. So if you're using a regular ruler, you're going to press these all open, and I generally press to the dark side. The way our pattern goes together, there's a couple blocks that you should press the other way, but it's not a big deal. If you just want to press them all to the darker fabric, or just one of the fabrics. Which one is this? This is C and D. No, this is B. This is B and D. So yeah, it's kind of hard to figure out, and it's not going to work on this pattern because on some blocks you've got seams coming together here on these two, and then you've got seams coming together here on these two. So I would just press them all consistently one way. Or the other thing that that I've done for half square triangles, when you've got seams coming together in an odd way, is to press them open, press your seams open. And then when it comes up against another half square triangle seam, oh, this is hot. Sorry. Usually I let them cool off before I press them open. But with your seams pressed open, you don't have as much bulk in your seams, especially when you end up with seams going the same direction. Okay, so if you're going to press them open, I would use a regular ruler first, then press them all open, and then come in here with your regular ruler. Make sure your diagonal's going, I'm left-handed, so I have it going upper left to lower right. If you're right-handed, it's going to be upper right to lower left. And then you would work your ruler this way, putting the diagonal on the seam, and then cut your two sides, rotate it, and cut the other two sides. But because I'm left-handed, I'm going to have my seam going left to right, top to bottom, line it up, trim it on two sides. And then with this is a rotating mat, which is nice to have. And on this one, I do have to rotate the ruler so I can line up my 3.5 inch. And then my 45 degree is right on the seam. There we go. So that one's done. And you can always, if you press your seams to one side, we can always change the direction of those seams later if we find that they're not nesting properly. So that's that way. I'm going to use my my trimmer, my triangle trimmer. And when you order this set of rulers, you actually get 2 templates, 2 trimmers. This one is for trimming blocks that are a 1/2 inch wide. So 3.5, 4.5, 5.5. And then the trimmer B is if you're trimming to 3 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches, 6 inches. So increments of a full inch. And then these are increments of an inch, but you're trimming to a 1/2 inch increment. So 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 6.5. So because we're trimming to 3.5, I'm going to use the trimmer A. And as I pointed out earlier, I put the 3.5 inch guideline right on my seam allowance, or my seam, my stitching. I put it just a thread or 2 above it, because when you press the fabrics open, you're going to lose just a little, you'll have a little bit, a thread or 2 that gets kind of caught up in that seam allowance. So I forgot to trim my dog ears. So also do the dog ears. There's little slots right there to put your rotary cutter into. And there's this one. And then I would press it open. So what I like to do, and what I'm going to do right now, is just go through and trim all my blocks, trim all my squares. I kind of work in batches, kind of like an assembly line. So I'll do all my cutting. I'll do all my sewing. I'll try to do chain piecing as much as possible. But if you're making 160 half square triangles, I wouldn't try to do them all at once. Then I break them up into batches. So I might do 8 at a time or 12 at a time, something like that. But I go through all of them, each step. So I cut everything, and then I sew everything, trim everything. And when I say everything, it could be 16 blocks, it could be 20 blocks. But that's a good batch to work with. And it's efficient because you're doing the same step over and over again. So you're not getting tools out, putting them away, getting tools out, putting them away. So is anyone sewing along as we go this morning?
I'm not ready for that yet.
Do you have your fabrics picked out?
Yes, I have my fabrics and I'm just marking them now. And then I have to sew them.
Okay, good job.
I guess I didn't understand the directions at the beginning. I thought that it was supposed to be a sew along, so I had my pieces all out and ready. So I've got them sewn together and trimmed. I'm fixing to lay them out to try and make the design.
Okay, awesome. So you had you sewed yours all together first, right? Before class?
No, I just sewed them together right now while you were sewing.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, once we get these all trimmed and pressed open, then we'll be ready to start assembling our block. All right, just a few more.
Yes. They're in my makeup drawer. Red hot. Yeah, I don't have any sage. I don't have any sage. No. Why do I want that? I make my own. Well, it's to go in the they don't have any? I'm just saying that. No, it's to go in the apple cider. All right, that's fine. It's not critical. No, and I don't know what you guys are making for dinner tonight. I made last night. No.
Okay, so I have all these trimmed. And so now I'm going to press them open, and I won't need that rotating mat anymore. So let's press everything open. And let's see, these were, oh, I didn't trim these three. Hold on, a few more. So the other nice thing about using this triangle trimmer is that you don't have to have a rotating mat because you're not turning your block. So even though trimming takes a while to do, it is important that all your blocks are the same. Otherwise, your points won't come together in a perfect point. You'll lose points, or you'll have floating points.
I've got floating points.
And when I say points, I'm talking about what comes out here to the edge. So see how these two blocks come together and make a nice point. This is a nice point here on the edge. If your blocks aren't the same size, it's hard to get that accuracy. Okay, so I'm gonna All right, so I know for the center, I did figure out if I do 2 towards the brown and 2 towards the golds, I think those would nest better. Okay, so and these are my B and Ds. I don't think it matters on those which way they go. So I'm going to do towards the brown. Someone's got background noise. Can you mute for a few minutes?
Oh, sorry.
What's for dinner? Okay, and then this is the C and D blocks, and I figured out that half of these should go to the green on mine, half to the green and half to the background, and they'll nest in a little bit better. And sometimes I'll do 2 at a time, pressing. It just goes a little bit faster because then I'm not setting my iron down as much. Okay, 1 more towards the green. And I'm just being careful as I press these that I'm not stretching my fabric. Otherwise, I won't have my 3.5 inch square. So ow, those are hot. So these 4 I'm going to press towards the background. Let's see if that works. There we go. Okay. So I think I'll have enough room on my mat here to lay these out. So you all can see how to lay them out. Or I have a design wall behind me, and usually once I have the blocks finished, then I'm laying out the different blocks to arrange those. And so I know, how to sew the rows together. But for a single block, you can just have a surface that you can lay them out so you know where they go. So I'm going to start with the center. Those are pressed towards the gold. Okay. So all the golds are going to go towards the center, and then these 2 will get sewn together like this. So I did press 1 to the gold or 1 to the brown and 1 to the gold. So those will nest together nicely. Okay, so that's the center. And then across the top, we have C and D. So the cream is, oh wait, yeah, that's right. So the cream is the D, and then we have C and D, which is this one. And then, C and D, and now, oop, that's wrong. C and D, so I'm following the guideline, C and D, and then B and D, so that's this one. And then D and C, that's this one. I might swap out some of these just to get might flip-flop some of these just so the seams are going the right direction. Okay, so then the next row, it's D and B this way there. So that kind of makes that little chevron there. Then on the other side of the center, we have C and D. So C and D this way. And then the third row, C and D this way. And then B and D on this side, B and D. There, so I've got my chevron, a chevron there. Then across the bottom here, we're gonna have C and D, oops, yep, C, yep, this one's wrong. Got my colors mixed up. This is C, this is C, this is D. C and D, B and D, D and C, and D and C. Okay, now I want to take a look at it and make sure it makes sense. So something doesn't look right. What did I do wrong? This one's wrong. I keep thinking this one's C. Okay. And then this is not right either. What did I mess up? D should be there. There we go. Okay. All right, that looks better. So you've got this is like a flying geese format here where you've got two of them, two colors the same coming in together. Okay, so I'm going to compare to the pattern just to make sure I have it laid out right. So I've got my center, I've got my orange or red going this way, and then I've got my flying geese, flying geese, flying geese, and flying geese. So that looks good. Now, again, I look at my pieces to figure out how can I chain piece all of this. So first, I want to check how these some of these seams are coming together. So this is pressed towards the brown. That's pressed towards the cream. So that'll be good. This one I might trade out with this one. Okay. So when I flip these, when those go together, they'll nest. And when these go together, they'll nest. And do you know what I mean by nesting? The seams are going opposite direction. So when I sew across here, these two seams, one is pressed towards the brown and the other one is pressed towards the cream. So those seams will nest up against each other instead of overlapping each other. All right, see if I can get these back in the right place. Okay, so that will nest, that will nest, that will nest. And maybe not everything will nest. Let's see, this one's let's see, this one, let's change this one. There we go. Yep, that'll work better. That will nest. That will nest. Which way is that one going? That will nest. That will nest. I can just feel it. I can tell which way the seam is pressed. That will nest. That will nest. Okay, that looks good. That will nest. Awesome. That worked out great. So what I did is on two of the center ones, I pressed towards the gold, and the other two I pressed towards the brown. And for the B, what is this? Oh, that one's pressed open. So since I didn't do any open, I'm just going to repress this one. So on all the B to D, all the B and D units, I pressed all of those towards the brown. So this one, this one, this one, and now this one. So all of those go towards the B fabric. There we go. Yeah, so that will nest, that will nest. And then on the C and D's, there's a total of 8 half square triangles. 4 of them I pressed towards the cream, and 4 of them I pressed towards the green. So then when these, for example, when these two get sewn together, they will nest in there on that seam, and I won't have a lot of bulk. It'll eliminate a lot of the bulk. Okay, so to do this quickly by chain piecing, I'm going to sew in pairs. So we have 16 blocks, 4 rows and 4 columns. So I'm going to sew those 2 together, these 2 together, these 2, and these 2. Then I'm going to sew these 2 together, those 2, and those 2. And I try to go in the same order. So we could just, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just stack these up in order of how I want to sew them, keeping my sew line on the right side. And that's how it'll feed right into my machine the same way. So I'm going to pick up these 2. I'm going to make sure that these seams are nested together and my points are coming. I don't know if you can see, the points are even. So I want to make sure that these squares are lining up on top of each other. And a lot of times I will, where's my pin cushion? Oh, come here, pin cushion. Hold on. Can't quite reach it. Find a small pin. Nope, keep pulling the giants out. Where are the little ones? There we go. I'll just put a little pin. Oh, I hope I didn't mess that up already. No, that's right. So it's real easy to get these turned around. Okay, now which side was I sewing? So a lot of times I'll match those up, and right away I'll put a pin in perpendicular to the seam that I'm going to sew. So now I know I'm going to sew this line, not this line. Okay, and I'm going to change to my 1/4 inch foot. This one's okay for the half square triangles because I know where to I know where the 1/4 inch mark is, but this one's a little more accurate. So when I'm doing the actual piecing, where we're piecing blocks together or units together, I want to make sure that, looking for a little scrap. I used to also use these little leaders, little scraps at the beginning just to get the threads out of my way. Okay. But I like this 1/4 inch foot for piecing because it's a lot more accurate. And I'll know that I'm going to lower my stitch length a little bit for this too. And by putting a pin in there, I know that those are going to come together exactly where I want them. And be careful of your other seams, that they don't flip over on you. And that's the hardest part. Oh, here, let me shift you over a little bit. There we go. So when you come to the edge here where you're sewing across this, across the seam, you want to make sure that your fabric doesn't shift or move. That's the most common issue that people have when sewing half square triangles together, is that because you're sewing over that seam, the fabric wants to kind of shift underneath the presser foot. Now this one, we have 2 seams, but they're on the opposite end of the block, so we don't have anything to nest there. So that's just a matter of lining it up, keeping the fabric lined up as you're sewing it. So holding those pieces together, making sure your seams don't flip on you, that they lay flat. If they flip over or flip up, then it creates a lot of bulk in your block, and then your block doesn't lay flat. All right, same thing on this one. There's 2 seams on either side, one at the top, one at the bottom. So I don't really have to pin this one. I just want to make sure that get it started sewing, put your needle down, and then just make sure that your sides stay even, your edges, and that you're continuing that 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Now this one, it's nesting at the top, so that one's a little bit easier to get started to sew this seam because it's at the beginning of the seam rather than the end of the seam. So again, just lining everything up. Okay, this one is nesting out the bottom. So again, just want to make sure everything, that point lines up together. So this is where I usually get off a little bit because the top fabric wants to shift down. And so you really want to kind of control that as you're sewing and make sure that the fabric's not shifting. Okay, these are all simple seams in the corners. Just want to watch that bottom seam doesn't flip over on you. Okay, I've got nested seams at the top on this one. Just going to put a pin in there so it doesn't come apart when I go to the sewing machine. But then I remove it right away. You know, try not to run over your seams or your pins. If your needle hits it, if your needle hits a pin, it's likely to mess up your needle. You'll have to change your needle, or it could break your needle. But it's also not good for your feed dogs, those metal teeth underneath, to be running over that with the metal pins. It kind of, over time, it can wear it out. Okay, put my little scrap in here. And then trim behind. All right, there's our chain. And now what I like to do is stack these in order as I cut them off. So that was the last one, the one before. So if I keep these all in order, when I sew things together, they'll be in the same place. Okay, so because this was the first one and we sewed down the seam like that, if we open this up, we went down the row. Okay, so there's an option here at this point. Make sure I get it the right way. You can press these open now, or you can sew the center seam. And I prefer to press them first. It's just easier when they're not all sewn together. So you need to make a decision now on which way you're going to go. So you could have this row all go to the left, this row all go to the right, or you could stagger it. So maybe that one goes to the left and this one goes to the right, just because of the design of the block itself. Just kind of what makes sense, but you want these seams to be able to nest when we sew them together this way. You want those seams to nest too. So if I start the first one to the left, the second one has to go to the right, the third one has to go to the left, and then the last one has to go to the right. Oops. And then same thing here, you know, it doesn't really matter, but I think these will lay better if we go to the right and then the left and then the right and then the left. Actually, I think with this pattern, with these blocks, it really doesn't matter. They're basically a mirror image of everything. So let's just give this a quick press. So keeping everything in the same order, we're just going to press that one to the left, this one to the right. And you'll see it just makes it easier when you go to sew your rows together if you press these now rather than later. And I think, you know, that's my best tip for people when you're quilting, is to always be careful how you're pressing. Make sure you're pressing your seams flat. You know, make sure your seams don't get flipped one way and then the other way. You'll have better accuracy if you're careful on which way you press your seams and making sure that they don't get flipped. And if I sew a seam, so say I get to the end and I'm sewing the rows together and something gets flipped, I'll fix it just because I know it's not going to lay flat if the seams are flipping two different directions. Okay. So the next step is to sew the pairs together. So just flipping it like that. Stacking it up. Let me turn the camera a little bit. There we go. All right, so those two are nesting, yay. Okay, so I'm going to go through this step fairly quickly because it's just the same as what we did for the pairs. Just want to make sure that you've got your blocks lined up really nicely so they'll press open flat and straight. Those two are nesting, but because they're at the top, I'm not going to pin this time. I have a nice big surface here. I can slide stuff around, so I don't have to worry about it moving on me. These are nested at the bottom, so I will pin that just so the two layers don't shift on me. And I want to be careful when I'm sewing this one that this bottom seam doesn't flip down on me. So as you're sewing, when you get close to that seam, well, because I put a pin through it, it's not going to flip. But I'd still check it anyway, just right before I get ready to sew over that seam, I just check it to make sure it's going the right direction. And here's another little tip. So the way I laid these out, the seam is at the bottom. Well, I just have to sew that seam. So I could flip it over this way. And now the nested seams are at the top. I just have to remember that I flipped it when I lay it back out. But that's another way to make sure that those corners are matching up correctly. Because if your fabric is going to shift, it's going to be towards the end of your seam rather than the beginning. So feel free to, flip your block over, turn it around, or whatever works to get those seams up to the top, because they'll lay flatter that way. It'll be easier to get your seams to match up. They won't shift. Throat's getting dry. Okay, that one goes in later. All right. So again, I just lay it out to make sure I have everything going the right way. And because I chain pieced, it should just pop right up. But see, because that one I flipped around, it needs to be flipped back around. There we go. All right, so now on this one, let's see what makes sense to, I guess it really doesn't matter, but let's press towards the darker fabric here, the browns. So the first row, I'm going to press to the right. So because I already pressed those other two pieces, it's easier to get in there and do that center one. So that one went to the right. So this one's going to go to the left. this one will go to the right. Falling off my desk. And then this one goes to the left, which is the darker fabric. So that is a good idea to do it that way. When you press to the lighter fabric, that darker fabric, might show through a little bit. Okay, so there we go. We have our 4 rows done. Now we just need to sew the rows to each other. So you could flip this one up or flip this one down. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to flip the top one down. And now the critical joins are these block seams. So where we join the pairs together, we want to make sure that those line up. So you just want to, and because we went opposite directions, they will nest right together. So you can kind of feel them just slide it up, one up against the other, and then just put a pin in, wherever it's gonna fit. If the other thing you can use are these Wonder Clips. Those are great too for just clipping down your seam allowance. Sometimes the pins will, kind of distort the fabric a little bit. All right, so this one, just making sure that it's going straight into that. Those seams are nesting. That one's too big. Now this seam, when I sew over this seam, it's going that direction. So I want to make sure that it doesn't get flipped. So I put the pin right through that seam allowance. But I'll check it as I'm sewing. All right, I'm checking this one. Those two are nested together. Again, the seam is going upward against the feed dogs, upstream, I call it. So when the seam is going down, the feed dog, it's not fighting against the feed dogs of your machine. Okay, so I like to pin a lot, pin or clip. I just know it's just, for me, it's faster and I feel it's more accurate, but I'll show you another way to not have to pin. If you don't pin, then you have to match up your fabrics as you're sewing. All right, so now I'm coming up on all these seams. So I do want to make sure that they lay flat. So I'm taking this little tool here. I don't have a stiletto, but this one works. This works like a stiletto. And a stiletto is just a pointy thing that allows you to push down on the fabric as it goes under the needle. Because those seams were going towards the needle, the presser foot wanted to flip them over. So I'm checking to make sure that seam is going the right direction. And so when I feed it through, it should stay. Now, sometimes they'll get caught on your feed dogs and get kind of crinkled up. There isn't much you can do about that. Sometimes just lifting the presser foot, making sure everything's laying flat. Okay, and again, we can chain piece these because we've got pairs here. All right, so what if we don't want to pin everything? It's such a habit of mine, I can't help it. Okay, so I pinned the first one, but if you don't want to pin, you at least line up the first one, get it started. And so all I'm worrying about is this first seam allowance. And again, I'm going to get my stiletto because the fabric's wanting to flip over on me. And once you get into this seam, then line up your next seam. But see, to me, this is harder to line up when it's on the machine. So I'm just going to hold this now with some pressure from my finger. And then feed it into the presser foot. Once you get over top of that seam, that one's locked in now, my needle's down, so my fabric's not going anywhere. I'm going to match up this next seam. And the seams are nesting nicely. I'm making sure everything's lining up on top and bottom too, because you don't want to be way off on the width either. So just holding that seam together. So instead of pinning, I'm just using my finger to hold the fabrics as I send it through the presser foot. And my iron turned off again. Okay. So this is the top one. And this is the bottom one. Very good. Now, again, I like to press these and let's see. And I would just recommend pressing them in one direction or the other. You could also spin these two side seams, and spinning just means you pop that seam right there, and you're going to press that seam that direction and this one this direction. Get it to lay nice and flat, and then put your iron on top and press those seams. And so what you end up with is just this little pinwheel in the center. But the blocks do, your seams lay a lot flatter that way. But you can't spin this center one here because it would go in the opposite direction. So this one's gonna, and that's pretty bulky. That's pretty bulky. So you know what, but that's bulky if I go that way. So sometimes you just can't avoid all the bulky seams. But I can spin this other one. So that little bit of seam needs to come apart right there. There. So this one's going to come, this one's going to come down, and this one's going to go up. So I like to press from the front to make sure that I don't have any creases in that seam allowance. Okay, so this one all goes that way. Okay, just gonna press down real hard. You can also use what we call, you could use some bus press spray to help those lay flat, but that tends to get my fabric too wet. So I like using this water pen. It's by Clover. And I just put a little bit of water just on that seam right there that needs to be flat. And it just helps flatten out the fabric. Get a little bobble there. Okay. It's hard to get that bulky seam flat. I'm almost tempted to. Tempted to just let it flip the other way. Okay, so this is what happens when you, so one end of the seam is going up and the other end is going down. So I get a little bit of a crease there, but it's not as bad as having all the bulk in the center here. So, and then some people, what they'll do is they'll snip, just snip your seam just a little bit. You don't want to go maybe just 1/8 of an inch. And then that just helps the seams lay flatter. And that's the only time that I would, press them in different directions, is just to help reduce some of that bulk. All right, so that's nice and flat. Let's spin these two. And this one. Hopefully you can still see. Okay, just getting those seams nice and flat, nice and open. Sometimes you got to wrangle with them, force them. Well, there's just one more seam, and it's basically the same thing, but I'm going to fold this one over like I did the other one. And so your final seam is just going to be that center seam right there, and then your block is finished. That went by fast. And I just wanted to show you next month's project. We're gonna do a Thanksgiving pumpkin table runner. And we probably won't have time to finish the whole thing, but I'll show you this applique technique. Oops, here we go. I'll show you how to do machine applique. on one, we'll do one pumpkin, and then you can take the technique and make your table runner, or if you just do one, it could be a table topper, that you put in the center of your table. Or you could make a banner out of it, just a single wall hanging. But I thought that'd be a cute fall project to work on next month. Oh,
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
and then I just did some pretty pumpkin Thanksgiving fabric on the back. So it really is reversible.